Now let me move, if I may, from that overall view of what we've been trying to do to the very specific problems of the Eurozone. Because the important characteristic of the Eurozone is that essentially it's the same process, but without the same adjustment mechanisms and without the same financial conditions, it is generating severe sovereign insolvency risk. And that changes the nature of the crisis in absolutely fundamental ways, which also happen to be extremely dangerous even on a global level, because some of the debtors are really, really big debtors. Italy is, I think, the third or fourth, it wobbles day by day, largest debtor in the world. In essence, what happened in the Eurozone was a microcosm of, exacerbated by, the global conditions I described. Essentially at a time of very low real interest rates and very easy credit supply, a number of countries and individual borrowers and corporations that had previously been unable to borrow easily because they were in countries like Italy and Spain, which used to have, or Ireland, high interest rates and was regarded as high risk, suddenly found they could borrow on terms never before possible. All risk spreads on sovereign bonds in the Eurozone disappeared. There was even, miraculously, a period in 2006, if I remember correctly, when Irish bonds offered lower interest rates. Think about where Ireland is today. Lower interest rates than Germany. Not much lower, but the spread was negative. Essentially, they were treated as riskless, and so were all the banks associated with them. There was no sign of risk perception in the credit default swap market. And in that context, enormous capital flows emerged within the Eurozone. It became a microcosm of the world, with Germany as an enormous surplus country, gaining competitiveness year by year, the constant fall in inflation and in unit labor costs, because there was no housing bubble in Germany, they didn't let it happen, and the peripheral countries which found these incredibly attractive conditions going on the borrowing binge of all time. Much of it private borrowing into the housing sector, that was particularly dramatic, construction sector in Italy, in Ireland and in Spain. In some cases, it was predominantly fiscal, but it didn't really matter. It just depended on who was willing to borrow. And the borrowings became incredible, and the current account deficits that Spain, Portugal, and Greece were able to run amounted to 10% of GDP. And when you can borrow that much to import tradable goods and services, which obviously were what they were importing, you can allow your unit labor costs to go through the moon. You can allow your wages to go up because you don't have to be competitive. You just can import it through these capital flows. And they became dramatically uncompetitive. The worst story of all is that the unit labor costs in manufacturing of Greece relative to Germany rose between 1999, the beginning of the Eurozone, and today by 80%. Now, Greece is in a class of its own, but even Spain and Italy experienced relative rises in unit labor costs of manufacturing of close to 40%. So a huge structural competitive advantage emerged in Germany, and these countries became hopelessly uncompetitive. It is important to stress, because people oversimplify this story, that this is not predominantly, as I've said, a public finance story. It's an easy credit story where it went to very dramatically. The most interesting indications of what I've just said are actually Ireland and Spain. Because Ireland's story is so extraordinary, and I don't know how many people know it. I've never seen anything like this before. Just before the financial crisis hit, the net public debt of Ireland was 10% of GDP. Essentially, Ireland didn't have any public debt. It was essentially zero. Nor was the Irish welfare state and welfare state promises particularly generous. Taxes were relatively low. The fiscal position was incredibly strong. Now, 4 years later, the net public debt of Ireland is more than 100% of GDP. In 4 years, it went from 10 to 110, roughly. About a third of this was because they had to bail out all their banks, or they felt they had to bail out their banks, or they were forced to bail out their banks. There are many different versions of this story. It's actually a bit of both, or a bit of all three. And about two-thirds is because they hit the most whopping recession, because their housing sector imploded, their banks disappeared, they went into freefall. Spain is a less extreme version of the same story, but prior to the crisis, Spanish net public debt was slightly over 20% of GDP, and much better than Germany's or France's, or if I may say so, the US or the UK. Today, Spain's public debt is rising rapidly because it has huge fiscal deficits as a result of its economic collapse, and now increasingly because it has to bail out its banks. The fiscal crises in these cases, and this is also largely true of Portugal, are a consequence of the crisis, not a cause of the crisis. Greece is, in fact, sui generis. Now, when the crisis hit, and people start saying to themselves, wait a minute, let's just see whether these people actually have the slightest chance of ever being able to pay us back. Something that pretty well everybody in the financial sector seems to have forgotten was an important element in finance prior to the crisis. This is way beyond, this is European subprime we're talking about here. The subprime included governments. So they suddenly realized there was a problem. And when they realized there was a problem, and here we're talking particularly about German bankers and French bankers, British bankers, the Americans are not essentially involved in this, the money just stopped. Just stopped. The spreads exploded, and quite suddenly, governments that had been able to borrow as if there was no tomorrow could now no longer borrow at all. And that was the crisis. It started with Greece and then Ireland and Portugal. There was another wave later which got to Spain and Italy. And the characteristic in all these cases was people stopped borrowing, stopped lending across the borders, risk spreads exploded, interest rates very quickly moved up on these sovereign debts to rates at which they could no longer manage the rollovers at all. So how did the Eurozone manage this enormous crisis in their internal balance of payments? Because nobody was prepared to lend cross-border to finance these governments that were clearly dependent on foreign finance. And the answer is one that is quite surprising and very well hidden until relatively recent, and rather thrilling. Namely, the European Central Bank financed all this through its lender of last resort operations for banks. Essentially, the European system of central banks allowed the national central banks to provide liquidity to domestic business and, far more importantly, to domestic governments. And the European Central Bank was willing to accept the collateral of the government paper, haircut somewhat, as collateral for its lending. And as a result of these processes, through the monetary system, the European Central Bank emerged as the European Monetary Fund, as I've called it. And the Germans, obviously, through this intra-bank financial system, ended up financing the periphery through official channels. And because the ECB hated this so much, it really essentially forced governments to start creating these more official funds, which are the ones you've heard about: the European Financial Stability Facility, the European Stability Mechanism, the IMF programs. But even now, today, the dominant financier is in fact the European Central Bank, and this is all shown up in the internal balance sheets of the banks, of the central bank, which currently I think shows a net credit creditor position for the Bundesbank to the tune of something like 700 billion euros, which I think is about a quarter of German GDP. I would have to check, but I think it would be about that. So Germany has been forced, as creditors always are when their debtors go under, to bail them out, because it doesn't want to write off the losses, and it doesn't want to write off its export sector. So that is essentially how the Eurozone system is being managed, through this heroic intervention, in the hope that somehow or other everything will work out. The latest stage of this was this truly astonishing long-term refinancing operation announced very quietly by Mario Draghi last December, in which in just 2 months the Eurozone advanced 1 trillion euros, which is real money, to by anybody's standards, what would that be, $1.3 trillion, something like that, to banks that were in this crisis situation no longer able to finance themselves at all, many of them being German.